Very good afternoon to everyone. My respect for Pak Dubes and my colleagues from the government of Indonesia who are here in Singapore, and of course Ambassador Shahid Ali and Pak Leonard Sebastian from RSIS, distinguished guests who are here. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here at this event where I know many of you have been attending in the past to have a discussion on both international and regional issues, but also to find out the responses to all these issues that nations and societies are called upon to carry out. Those discussions are often lively and fruitful, and also relevant to all of us in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, and the world over. I'm therefore glad to be here with you to share with you a perspective on Indonesia from an economic standpoint, the challenges that Indonesia faces, and also the opportunities that may come within Indonesia's reach. Let me begin with citing an item from a recent book by Al Gore entitled The Future. In it, it talked about a massive eruption of the Tambora volcano in 1815, which pretty much packed the atmosphere with particulates, resulting in the year without summer in 1816. That led to crop failures all over the world. It also brought about a wave of revolutions in Europe and mass migrations in many regions, and people sought food and warmth. In the world of nature, one volcanic eruption can change the destiny of humankind. My friends, I'm here to assure you that in the world of economics during our time, the economic volcanoes that could change the destiny of humankind are not in Indonesia nor in Southeast Asia. If they exist, and I doubt if they do, they're elsewhere. We have seen in the past few months signals made by the Fed Reserve in the US as to try to taper off quantitative easing, which basically took place in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. And we've been able to enjoy the huge liquidity that's been pumped into the system that would have been perpetuated by the Fed ever since. And we've seen rising stock markets, rising commodities prices, and also rising current account balances in a good way. The signal that was conveyed to the world a few months ago has brought about concerns to many economies around the world. Indonesia being one of the many countries or economies that have been affected by way of the liquidity moving back out of the system into the US. And strangely, this money that's going back to the US is not going into the capital markets as people would have expected. It's chasing yield, and we're seeing a ramp up in treasury yields in the past couple of months, and Indonesia has experienced what it did not anticipate months ago. There is likely more to come, and there's likely to be more economies that will be affected, including Indonesia and many other large emerging economies. This will affect the current accounts of Indonesia and other economies. As we have seen in Indonesia, our trade account has been affected, our current account has been affected. We are about to announce today or tomorrow the result of our trade balance in the month of July. Clearly, not only a continuation of what we saw in June and May, but a potential exacerbation that may sustain in the many months to come. As a result of which, Indonesia has announced a package of measures, fiscally and non-fiscally, as to help basically bring about balance between macroeconomic stability and growth. I think it's clear that the government of Indonesia is putting premium on being able to maintain stability in the years to come. We're also seeing a deceleration of growth in China as a result of slowing demand from Europe and also from the US. We can talk about the debates about how Europe is going to fare in the years to come. We can also talk about the debates that people have been engaged in about the state of affairs in the US and going forward. We're seeing signs of recovery in the US by way of not only the strong demographic bonus that prevails, but also the potential significant energy transformation. As such, I think there is likely to be a recalibration of the global economic outlook. And inevitably, Indonesia will be a beneficiary of whatever that outlook is. That's on a global stage. Whereas on a domestic stage, Indonesia has gone through many stages in the past few decades. If we were to go back to the end of the Sukarno regime, we had a GDP per capita of about $500 US. At the end of the Suharto regime, we had a GDP per capita of about $1,200. But by way of the economic crisis or the financial crisis in 1998, it got corrected from $1,200 to about $600. And we began the democratization. We began the economic overhaul. We began lots of things that the 250 million people in Indonesia were never familiar with. But we were able to bounce back from the brink of what would have been or could have been the Balkanization of Indonesia, or Indonesia's being financially and economically moribund, to a point where it was able to rise up and bring about the GDP per capita to a level of $1,100 at the end of the Megawati administration. Came SBY, who brought about further changes, and he's been able to raise the GDP per capita to about $4,000 this year, and God willing, by next year, it may go up to even $5,000. So we've seen multiplication of the purchasing power of Indonesia going from sub $1,000 to well above $4,000. And now the question remains as to whether or not Indonesia will be able to come out of the emerging middle income trap. The middle income trap can only be overcome by way of progressively, proactively investing in the educational space. And we've got the fiscal space now like we never did. Our debt to GDP ratio has improved to about 23% as compared to about 90% 15 years ago. And we've got to take the right view on where to put the money and the industrialization roadmap. Our poverty rate has come down from about 17% to 11.9% in the past 6-7 years. And our unemployment rate has come down to around 6%. We basically have been able to take more than 10 million people out of poverty we have been able to take 15 million people out of unemployment in the last 5, 6, 7 years. However, the Gini ratio has not improved. It's actually at 41 vis-a-vis 31 some years ago, which clearly reflects the widening gap between the poor and the rich in Indonesia. It is a reflection of how concentrated money is, development is, and how concentrated capital formation has been in the past few decades. But the good news is, if we take a pulse check on where things were in 2009 and where it is in 2012, capital formation outside the island of Java in 2009 was a mere 18% of total capital formation. Whereas in 2012, capital formation outside the island of Java has gone up to about 46%. And this is a percentage of the total capital formation which has been steadily increasing 25 to 30% year on year for the past 3 to 4 years. Another domestic challenge from an economic standpoint is our over-dependence on commodities. From a trade standpoint, our exports have been predominantly driven by commodities, about 65%, although that percentage has been declining in the past 2 to 3 years to about 62%, evidenced by a clear increase of manufacturing activities that have yielded exportation in the past 2 to 3 years. As I said, distribution of capital not only has gone out of Java, but it also has gone into sectors that are well beyond mining and oil and gas. We're seeing money being put to work in service, in manufacturing, in agriculture, and also anything that allows us to move up the value chain. Infrastructure development is also another challenge for Indonesia. We take a look at the logistics cost vis-a-vis the GDP. It's around 20%, well above the ratio for most other large developing countries, much less developed countries, which have ratios of well below 10% in terms of their logistics costs vis-a-vis the GDP. Electrification is reflected by way of less than 1,000 kilowatt hour per capita, and that's something that has to be game changed in the next 5, 10 to 15 years in order for us to come out of the middle income trap. The interest rate environment is also a challenge. Yes, we've been able to bring down inflation from the 70% level 15 years ago to levels well below 10%. Our interest rate has unfortunately been raised just a few days ago, and this was a necessary policy imperative from a monetary standpoint to mitigate the risks of capital flight by way of the taper off of quantitative easing. I don't foresee in the midterm or long term our monetary policy tolerating with further hikes of interest rates. Nonetheless, this has to be backed by a continuing improvement in our investment climate so that people not only believe in the thesis of investing in Indonesia, but also with the ease of doing business in Indonesia. Now, after having talked about the challenges of Indonesia at the global and domestic levels, we can talk about the opportunities. I've been talking about the existence or the prevalence of what I call the Justin Bieber generation, the Selena Gomez generation, the Cowboy Junior generation. I finally draw laughter from the crowd. These are the guys who are basically hungry for a new Indonesia, 15 years from today, there is going to be at least 150 million people who are going to be younger than 30 years old. Now, the key is to make sure that these 150 million people would have attained the necessary education, including at the RSIS, including at all the best universities and academic domain in the world. Now, the question is, do we have the fiscal space to do it? Yes, we do. By way of law, we are allocating at least 20% of our government budget for educational purposes. And now, at the rate that we're decentralizing our fiscal posture, at least 40% of our wallet is being decentralized to the provinces. And that percentage is only going to go up, with the hope and prayers that the regional leaders will be able to understand the 21st century paradigm, so that the money being spent is actually being spent in a good way. This underlines the point about having to sharpen our educational infrastructure. And this is something that has to be a policy imperative going forward. Otherwise, we will end up with a bunch of Justin Biebers just singing. We will end up with a generation that has not fulfilled their moral contract with their predecessors. We have a moral contract with the predecessors. We also have a moral contract with the future generation. As such, we've got to make sure that the runway is good for all of us, not only to land, but also to take off from. Another opportunity is reflected in our aspiration to move up the value chain. Moving up the value chain is not an exercise of simplicity. The upside potential is huge. If we were to accumulate the GDPs of Indonesia going from 2012 to 20 years thereafter, the amount is staggering. The accumulation of the GDPs for the next 20 years is roughly 60 trillion US dollars. That's the kind of cake that we're talking about for Indonesia on a cumulative basis for the next 20 years. If we were to go by the assumption that 60% of that cake is going to relate to domestic consumption, then we're talking about 36 trillion US dollars worth of goods and services that will be consumed by the 250 million people in Indonesia in the next 20 years. That number is definitely the number that we all must remember, not only for Indonesians, but for people in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, and also other parts of Asia, because that number will require a very, very strong and proactive supply-side narrative. Otherwise, we may just blow it. We may just not be able to make it in the next few decades. That's the challenge for the new generation of Indonesia. Yes, we can talk about the current posture from a demographic standpoint, in that 60% of our population are younger than 39 years old, and 50% of our population are younger than 29 years old. But we've got to make sure that these people are being bred, being infused with the necessary soft power so that we can become a great nation. The future of Indonesia, I think, hinges on what sort of a legacy that our president will leave with us as he steps off from the office at the end of next year, sometime in October. I think within logic, there's two clear legacies that he's going to be able to leave with us. The first is the seeming consolidation of ideologies and political parties. We are seeing a consolidation of the nationalist ideology. Nationalist in the sense that it is non-Islamic, nationalist in the sense that it is the ideology or philosophy that has been reflected in the preachings of the Golkars, the Democrats, and the PDIPs of the world. That ensures, to some extent, continuity of policy making and policy implementation. The other idea, the other legacy that SBY is going to be able to leave on the table for all of us is the foundation for sustained economic trajectory going forward. And this would have been successful by way of the pro-job, pro-poor, pro-growth, and pro-environment strategy that he has embarked upon ever since 2004. Coupled with the execution of the MP3EI, which really clusters economic development in 6 different corridors, which would ensure that job creation and capital formation takes place in as many different parts of Indonesia as possible. Indonesia, therefore, must be cognizant and proactive with respect to the continuation of economic development with emphasis on equity. As I've said earlier, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has widened. Dispersion of capital is not ideal, yet improving. We've got to further reduce poverty from the 11-point-something% to lower than 10%. We've got to reduce unemployment rate from 6-point-something% to less than 4%. We've got to make sure that our fixed capital formation ratio rises from 32% of the GDP to at least 35 to 40%. We want to make sure that the investment thesis in Indonesia works, and it works for the better of the people so that we can actually move up the value chain. We have to make sure that we increase the tax ratio from 15.5% to at least 25 to 30%. Fewer than 20 million people and companies in Indonesia pay taxes. Think about that. I think we have a few more than 20 million people in the population. Now, if we were to take the view, whatever view that needs to be taken to ensure that the number of people paying taxes rises well above the 20 million, there's a good chance that Indonesia will be able to reduce tax rates, but a lot more in terms of increasing tax revenues for the benefit of creating a much bigger fiscal space for the purpose of creating the necessary infrastructure for the future of Indonesia. Outside the economic development with equity, I think the future of Indonesia has to involve Indonesia's increasing its own geopolitical relevance in the world. I always think about Gangnam Style. I think the example of South Korea has been phenomenal in that Gangnam has been able to project South Korea in terms of 4 key factors. The first is that its cultural richness. The second, its democratization process. The third, its economic robustness. And the fourth, its technological advancements. I think any country that wants to stay relevant in the geopolitical construct must make sure that it has to Gangnam itself. And the word for Indonesia is that we've got to Garuda ourselves. It's relevant for all of us in Indonesia. Now, think about this. We've got to be a lot more relevant from a geopolitical standpoint. Why? 2 things come to mind. The first is that we have the potential of serving as a middle power that could reduce the soft power deficit between the Middle East and the West by way of our being the largest Muslim country, by way of our being the 3rd largest democracy in the world, by way of our being the 15th largest economy in the world, and even climbing over the years. If we were not able to leverage upon those very qualities to ensure that there is a higher degree of geopolitical relevance for Indonesia, then mission unaccomplished. The second is that we have the potential to serve as a middle power for the purpose of bridging between the interest of China and the interest of the United States. Knowing that China and the United States will be the top two economies in at least the next 30 years. Again, by the qualities of us being the third largest democracy in the world, the largest Muslim country in the world, and an improving economic sizing in the next decades, should provide a path for Indonesia to attain a higher degree of geopolitical relevance. It's not easy. As such, we've got to do it. Now, how do we get there? I don't think it's possible without our being able to attain political order in Indonesia. And this relates to the very point that I've raised a few times in the past, in that Indonesia must embark on what I call Democracy 2.0. Democracy 2.0 is really all about making sure we reduce the bureaucratic dead weight. We make sure that the bureaucracy gets paid well. We make sure that we understand the 21st century. We make sure that we put as much money as possible into high quality and large scale education. And we tell the world that we want to stay connected. We could do it by way of strengthening our agricultural sector, our manufacturing sector, by way of increasing our financing capabilities. All those are on track. They may not be reflected in superlative terms, but the key is directionality. Have we been able to show directionality? I think so. By way of the belief that people have in the investment thesis in Indonesia, and by way of our aspiration to use that as equity and capital for the future of Indonesia to attain a bigger and better political order. Without a political order in the system that involves Democracy 2.0, it will be futile to even think about attaining a higher degree of geopolitical relevance. If we go back to the Sukarno days, the kiss of death was the words counter or contra-revolutionaries. If we were to go back to the days of Suharto, the contra words or the kiss of death was communism. But if we were to allude to what's taboo during this SBY administration and beyond, it is really corruption. People don't like corruption, which is why we're seeing political phenomena taking place in Indonesia by way of personalities that represent the antithesis of the very government that sometimes lend the wrong kinds of perceptions. Now, I think without Democracy 2.0, by way of improving the compensation, improving the bureaucracy, improving the education, we're not going to be able to eradicate corruption as quickly as we aspire. But this is with full cognizance of the fact that eradicating corruption is really a 30-year game. It is not something that we could easily do in 2 to 3, 4, or 5 years. It will take a longer time. But if we believe in it, I think this is something that we're going to be able to do in the decades to come. Now, being a middle power in terms of reducing the soft power deficit, in terms of bridging between the interests of the two largest economies in the world, is no mean task. By way of the requirements of the political order within the country, but also the solidity of the regional cohesion. Unfortunately, we've seen in the past couple of years increases in bilateralism and also regionalism. And this is unfortunately contrary to the very spirit of multilateralism. This unfortunately relates to the very spirit of the Doha round. Now, we have been trying to advance the spirit of multilateralism since 2001 at the Doha round, but we have failed miserably. Doha has been in coma for many, many years. There is hope. There is hope that in the next few months, when Indonesia become host to the WTO meeting in December in Bali, that we may be able to advance the spirit of multilateralism. Why is it so important for the very spirit of regionalism and bilateralism? It may sound counterintuitive, but without the necessary spirit of multilateralism, it'd be a lot more difficult in the long run to actually advance the solidity of any regionalism. Thankfully, ASEAN, I think, is one of the most perfect, if not better, symbols of solidity of unification. We're different from that of the Europe, but the very much underrated commodity of ASEAN is that we haven't had wars in the past 50 years in Southeast Asia. The very three pillars of socio-cultural, political security, and economic pillars of ASEAN have held us together. This is key for the very purpose of each member country of ASEAN to ensure that he or she can attain the necessary political order, that Indonesia can necessarily attain the political order so that Indonesia could become a lot more geopolitically relevant. Now, I'm a believer and I'm an optimist for the very solidity of the ASEAN cohesion, brotherhood and sisterhood. This will, I think, take all of us in ASEAN many miles from today, many years from today, in a good way. The future of Indonesia, I like to talk about the future of Indonesia because this is really a political year. The future of Indonesia, I think, really involves a set of criteria that more and more people in Indonesia are gravitating to recently, and I think in the months and years to come. It's really about who out there of the 250 million people can bundle pluralism, democracy, economic development with equity, and project that bundle to the international community in a good way. And if she or he can't do that, it will all be an exercise of futility. And that is, I think, increasingly the Justin Biebers and Selena Gomez's and the Cowboy Juniors are gravitating to. The narrative of success is one that brings about Indonesia as a nation state in a good way, by way of its strong pluralistic values, strong democratization process, strong economic trajectory, and in making sure that it stays in the international community as a point of relevance, if not of higher relevance. Is it easy to find that? No. Yes, Indonesians are gravitating more and more to the social media. They're tweeting, they're using Facebook, they're letting go of the conventional means of communicating, but it will take time. As much as Indonesia is the second largest Facebook users in the world, as much as Indonesia is the second or third largest Twitters in the world, it will take time for Indonesia to understand the 21st century paradigm. It will take time for Indonesia to understand that the next leadership, or rather the criteria for the next leadership of Indonesia, are such. Now it's all up to us to tell ourselves and everybody around us that this is what matters. As with Gangnam Style, I think Indonesia and Indonesians have a duty to tell ourselves and everybody around the world that we've got the wherewithal to move forward with the necessary democratic values, with the necessary requirements to be better technologically, with the necessary requirements to enrich our culture, with the necessary requirements to be an economic, robust country. Are we there yet? We're probably there on some accounts, but there's one or two that we've got to work on, and it dovetails back to a lot of the stuff that I was talking earlier in terms of educating ourselves, game-changing ourselves as to better understand the 21st century paradigm. Moving back to the early part of the remarks, all these are possible. All these are possible because what Indonesia and Indonesians need to think is really the message that was conveyed to Winnie the Pooh. And that was that you are bigger than what you think you are. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.